Open innovation. There is potentially a new actor that is entering the open innovation arena, and these new actors are public sector organizations. That is what we believe is the next big wave talking about open innovation, meaning that now more and more public sector organization, government organization will more and more entering the open innovation arena and start collaborating with startups. I recently wrote an article on this specific topic on Sifted Financial Times, trying to explain why we believe this is the next big things to happen, talking about open innovation. And the article was focused on a very, very interesting leading example that is TfL, Transport for London. Transport for London is the local government body responsible for most of the transport network in the British capital. And today, I have the pleasure to have as my guest Rikesh Shah. Rikesh is the head of commercial innovation at TfL. Hi, Rikesh.
Hi, Alberto. Lovely to be here.
Nice to have you. And Rikesh, again, I remember that in a prior Mind Chat with Martin Curley. Martin is the Director of Digital Transformation and Open Innovation at Health Service Executives, the Irish NHS. Martin says something that I think made me think a lot, and they say that public organizations aren't designed for innovation and change. They are designed for the status quo. And it was a pretty strong starting point. And the positive side of that is that HSE was able to actually revert this status quo and put open innovation and startup collaboration in motion. And then I think another interesting leading example here is Transport for London. And that's why I would like to take the opportunity to have you sitting with me to elaborate a bit more the experience that you guys went through. And if I can remember, I think the first big step that TfL made was opening your core data. Yep. So, for example, timetables, routes, fares, and allow to develop an API to that. And that was probably the first step that moved to having a dedicated organization unit focused on innovation that is actually the innovation hub that you lead. And so I will start from there, if you can provide a bit more detail in terms of the background that brought you to the point that you are today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alberto. And, just to give you an overview of Transport for London, just building on what you said, pre-pandemic, we're responsible for 31 million journeys every day in London. And innovation's in our DNA. So, going back to the 1800s, we had horse and carts on the surface transport network. And then someone came up with the concept, Charles Pearson, of the metro. And in the 1863, Charles Pearson introduced the Metropolitan line, or the start of the Metropolitan line, which is one of the first metros in the world. And similarly, we did the same with the first traffic light in the world outside the House of Parliament. So innovation is in our organization and our city's DNA. And over time, we've brought in a wide range of innovative ideas. And I think your point about open data is another example of innovation coming into London. So tracking back a few years now, 10, 15 years, what we realized is people, as we were publishing data on our websites or PDFs, timetables on our website, people were scraping the data. And when they were scraping the data, they were getting things wrong because they were putting it into their own widgets or their own early days of the apps in those worlds, in that time. And by them getting things wrong, people were complaining to TfL to say the information that I'm getting about my transport service is wrong. So what we realized is when we started to move into a API-led website in early 2014, we made the decision at the same time to say, rather than just giving the website to tfl.gov.uk, why don't we also give the data openly through a unified API? So whether it's tube timetable data, bus data, the real-time view of where the transport service is, we said, let's put that out there. So as a result of putting that data out there, we're working in partnership with the developers, so the Apple Maps, the Google Maps, the Twitters, but also some really small niche players like Bus Checker and Citymapper and others, to create innovative ideas which allowed us to engage with the customer about transport services through the customer's channel of choice. And what we found winding forward is now we have over 17,000 developers accessing our data, over 700 apps. Some are very niche, some are very wide, some have lots of audiences, some have less audiences. But what we're finding is it embraces and brings in innovation based on those market innovators that are out there, because those 17,000 brains are helping support deliver some of the outcomes that we want for a city.
And that, I think, is a powerful example of how much you can get by sharing and how much external support you can leverage by doing something that's simple, that opening your data structure to 4 parties. But I think you made the story probably a bit too easy, because you say, okay, at a certain point in 2014, we decided to do that. I don't know exactly what was the internal discussion to get to the point, but probably you can provide some color there, because I'm expecting that sometimes making also some forward-looking decision might take some to overthrow some initial barriers. Obviously, we have never done something like that. Why we should do something like that? What are the potential risks? What's the problem? What if we lose the centrality of the information? Blah, blah, blah. So can you give us some color in terms?
Absolutely. So I think you're right. In any large corporate organization, whether it's a public sector or private sector, any form of change has to be managed. And you have multiple actors within an organization and outside an organization that you have to bring on side. So quite often this particular initiative was a change initiative. And as you can imagine, if other people are creating value from our data and their product value is increasing, people within TfL and others could be asking me, how do we leverage some of that value that other people are accessing? Also, what type of investment do we need to put in to this type of product development? And I think the fundamental point was that if it meant that 42% of Londoners are using an app powered by TfL data, it means that ultimately our goal is to encourage more usage of public transport, walking and cycling in our city. And we have a strategic goal of getting that to 80% by 2041. So if we think about the bigger picture and how this ecosystem of open data developers were using our data to encourage a behavior shift of using more public transport, doing more walking and doing more cycling, the argument was quite clear that we cannot work at the pace that some of these organizations are working at. And what we have to do is let's put some rules in place. You know, if we have concerns, let's make sure that if there's a commercial risk for us, we don't make that data open. If there's a legal risk for us, we don't make that data open. So any data that we release is aggregated, it's anonymous, it's not personal. And also if there's a technical risk for us where it'll cost us too much money and the return on investment isn't good enough, then let's not make that data open. So I think what's really important is we created open data as a product. And part of that product is you have a debate on what you release and what you don't release, but you put some clear KPIs in place and you create an agile way of working, which allows you to stop things from happening if you don't want them to happen. So we started small. We started with our static data, built confidence within the organization. And after static data, we moved to dynamic data, which is more complex because if you have to update the data every 30 seconds, that technically is more complicated and it requires more cost and resource. So we started small, gained confidence, and then we started to move into the more complex data sets. And perhaps in a minute, you might ask me about, do we have the same challenges with the Innovation Hub? But I'll come on to that after, because that's slightly different.
Yeah, again, this is a great example, because most of the time when we tell success stories or tell something that worked, that is your case, people tend to forget the pain, the problems, the experience that you ran through. And I think the goal of this conversation is to share best practice in a way that other similar organizations might fast track their experience by also learning from the experience of others. And also the point that you made, that there should be some clear goals, KPIs in place. It was being a gradual process. I think they are all a good advice to be shared. And moving to the Innovation Lab, again, probably the success of this IPI strategy moved to the next step of TFL. That is quite another fast forward move, that is to having a dedicated Innovation Hub. 2017, if I can remember, was the date. And probably you have been the first public transit authority to have a dedicated innovation unit. So can you also give us a bit more background, what move TFL to make such a choice? What has been the positive, potentially any problems that have needed to be overcome?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think there's a direct correlation between the open data work and the open innovation work. So what we recognize with the open data work and the partnerships we formed is there are people out there that can help solve our problems, but we need to frame the problem statement correctly. So when we moved into the Innovation Hub, we started to think about how can we make this a success? And some of the challenges that we found at the beginning there's 3 or 4. I think the first one is around culture and being quite risk averse. You know, what happens if we get something wrong? Or what happens if something doesn't work properly? The second one is the mindset that we have to make everything ourselves, or we have to prescribe the innovation to the market. You know, we don't want to necessarily share the problem statement. We'd rather share the solution. So that's all in the cultural space. I think the second area is the routes to market. We are a public authority, which absolutely means that we have to spend the taxpayers' money openly and transparently. So that means that you have to run open procurement procedures. So it's really important to think about the different routes to market. Otherwise, quite often what I see is a nice proof of concept, but it can't be scaled. So that's the second point. I think the third point is around process. And the process one is something that I've certainly learned quite a lot on over the last few years. You know, one is, if you're a large corporate or a large public body, you have lots of people from across the organization. So in my case, you might have the tube director, you might have the buses director, the roads director, the HR director, lots of different people. So how do you find the right sponsor to make sure that you've got someone in the business that's sponsoring the activity? And as part of the sponsorship, they're providing access to the asset, they're providing access to subject matter expertise, they're giving you access to data. Secondly, you need to make sure you've got the right problem statement. So it's really important that you spend time on defining that problem statement, because otherwise you can end up defining the wrong one. And if you get the wrong one, you come up with the wrong solution. Yeah. So it's important to spend time on that. Thirdly, it's about scouting with the market. And, and I've done some work with Mind the Bridge in the past, who have access to a brilliant ecosystem. How do we leverage some of the people out there that have contacts and networks across the world who could solve our problems? Because otherwise we end up working with the same people every time. And I think fourthly, run some trials, do them in an iterative way, learn from them, be prepared to stop them, iterate, and then ultimately, if you've got a business case, find a way to scale. So that comes back to the procurement. And if you can, at the end, even try and commercialize it. Because if it's genuinely innovative and you've created IP, intellectual property, you might be able to create some revenue lines too. So I think they're probably the 3 or 4 bits of advice I'd give.
You mentioned one point, that is prepare to stop them, because most of the time when you are trying to innovate, the typical outcome is that something is not probably working. And then is a very complicated situation to be managed.
Yep.
Particularly for organization in the early days when they still don't have the reputation that is built up over years of success stories. And so sometimes you might start, there is a lot of skepticism around you because, again, you are trying to innovate. There's always the party of people that are cheering for not changing anything. And so they're just waiting for you to fail. And sometimes you test and see that it doesn't make any sense. And the typical potential natural course of action is to continue, because, again, if you stop, that means that you failed and then can create a big reputation damage. But on the other hand, if you do not stop, you are wasting time and money, and you are probably distracting resources for the next thing that might be the right one. And so how is complicated to manage situations that are not working out and taking the killing decision of a project.
Yeah. So I think what we have is we have to be agile during this process. So we work in sprints. But what's really important is we constantly are reviewing where we are with the product or the project. So there's been instances where even before, as soon as someone's come to us with a problem statement, we have said, actually, we can't help you with this. You've already got you've already got solutions out there in the market. We'll add a little bit of value. So I think you should just go directly to the market and procure this rather than innovating with us. In other instances, we've closed things at the next stage. So we go to the market, we see what's out there, we bring ideas back, and we might run a trial. And then during the trial, we would say, let's stop this because we can't take it anymore. So I think what's really important is always be prepared to say, as you prioritize things, be prepared to take the right ones on and be prepared to stop at any time. But one lesson we learned is don't always start with the most glamorous projects that you think innovation can add value. Start with the ones that are most grounded and that you think you can add value quite quickly. So when we started some of our activity, one of the first projects we worked on wasn't, you hear about all these glamorous things in the future of mobility. The first topic we started on was adverse impact of roadworks. So I think what's really important is pick a topic. Don't try and be too ambitious with the first few. Be realistic with your expectations, learn from it, and then push the boundaries later on. Because I think if you pick a project that's too complicated at the beginning, it makes your life much harder.
Yeah, because it's obviously more complicated. So trying to get some quick wins is probably one of the golden rule to be followed. And so you mentioned London Freight Lab. The other one is London Road Lab. That are probably two of the challenges that you launched. Can you wrap up the challenges that currently, as Innovation Hub, you're working around, and what are the solution that you are looking at?
Yep. So there's a wide range of ways the Innovation Hub works, and in some ways we work with.
How many people are working inside the Innovation Hub? Just also to size you.
Yeah. So directly we'll have 15 people, but it's a matrix organization. So what happens then is, in some instances, we could have 50, 60 people in the Innovation Hub at once. So it's a virtual Innovation Hub. We work on about 5 to 10 problem statements at one given time. And some of them could be innovation challenges, which you just mentioned, and I'll come on to in a second, like Freight Lab, Road Lab. So they primarily focus the startup community. We also run corporate partnerships. So just today, we've announced a partnership and some work we've done with Daimler on road safety. We've done something similar with Bosch. We also work with academics. We also work with other market innovators, including our supply chain. And we're doing some innovative things around innovation clauses in contracts and other things. So there's a quite wide-ranging ecosystem of innovators. Coming back to your point on the innovation challenges, so the few that we have, we're doing one around driver fatigue and health and well-being. We've done another one around active travel, encouraging more people to walk and cycle in London. We've also done one around retail, where as a large property developer, how can we bring more innovative solutions in the retail space? And then the two that I'll cover off, Road Lab and Freight Lab. So Road Lab focuses on the adverse impact of roadworks. And this one, we issued a problem statement to the market. And it was about, can anyone bring in smarter, technologies to help us reduce the adverse impact of roadworks. We worked in partnerships with the utilities, and it's really important to create this ecosystem. So the fiber people, the water utilities, the gas, we're all working together. And we used a process called the Innovative Partnerships Procedure. So that's a directive from the European Union.
Yeah.
So we worked together on the problem statement. We put that out to the market, and we worked with a company called Plexel, who's an innovation accelerator. And they scouted the world. We got hundreds of ideas back. We then shortlisted the ideas through the procurement procedure. And then what we did was we selected 9 companies to run 9 trials for 10 weeks in London. And that's unheard of, to do something where it's on the major roads. And we had 9 good ideas that we tested. And at the end of it, some innovators said, this is brilliant. I've been wanting to test this idea for years and I've just not had an opportunity. And then what we did after that was we developed the business case and then the cost benefit analysis. And then we down selected 2 companies. And we are now very close to we have awarded 2 contracts, one to social asset management, which focuses on social media sentiment and data. And as a result, our control center can know on social media if there's anything going on that they detect where they need to do something. So imagine if you on one of your social media channels put a picture of a water leak. Mm-hmm. What happens then is the algorithm will detect that, go into the control center, and the control center will validate it through CCTV and then deploy resource. So as a result, you can respond quicker.
Oh, that's cool.
And the second solution is focusing on modeling roadworks before they actually take place. So what impact will it have on air quality? What impact will it have on congestion? So when you're planning roadworks, you can manage the disruption in advance. So that's 2 examples, and we've scaled that project. So we've bought it from R&D. Now we're about to procure at scale for 2 to 3 years. So that's a great example of using that procedure as it should be from start to finish.
And I think just to pause you here, because there's a concrete example, is again, public procurement is another most spoken word, again, as a way for supporting the startup ecosystem, not just having private company procuring solution for startup, also public organization. And public procurement, if it's able to really work with startup SMEs, might also help them to scale up. So you have a double benefit. You are onboarding innovation, and you are helping the startup ecosystem to grow by deploying public money for supporting their growth, and on a certain way for sourcing innovation and solution for your organization. And that is quite an interesting data point. Sometimes this so much spoken word, public procurement, remains a word because at the end, the public organizations are not able to navigate through their own procedures, barriers, and to be able to put this partnership in place because it's too complicated. And so I think it might be super interesting to also to spend some time in the way you are able to procure from startups, because most of the time it's complicated, because typically public organization, in the way of procuring solution, they define the solution and they are looking for vendors, while if you really want to leverage the power of open innovation, as mentioned, you should state a problem and let the solution providers to identify some potential approaches to fill this gap. So how do you do that? This is front and center.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of points. I think there is a perception, particularly in the innovation space, and not just in the public sector, it's in the corporate sector, that there's a conflict between procurement colleagues and innovation colleagues. And what I have to say is, actually, after a few years, I've realized how important my procurement colleagues are, because without them, none of this is possible. And it's a journey. And I think what we have to do is there's this perception of innovation in organizations that people are maverick, they're going to be radical, they're going to break processes, they're going to, do lots of things. And in fact, that's not the case, because my job is to do things better, cheaper, and quicker, and create value for my city. And similarly, that's how the procurement team are thinking. And so as a result, how do we work together to say, how can you help me deliver the outcomes that we both want? And I think with some of the things that we've done is we sat down with the procurement team really early and we started to paint different scenarios of where we found blockages or problems. And then we created this innovation hub, which is a matrix hub where the procurement team are sat within the innovation hub. So they're not set separate in the procurement team, they are sat within the hub. So immediately from a cultural point of view, they're building a relationship with the innovation team. And then I think in terms of some of the delivery items, we started to deploy and think about different routes. So it's a mindset thing, which is you don't have to use the same procurement route every time. So some of the things that we've tried are, we use G-Cloud, and we're using that more and more. There's a Sparks framework, which you can use, which allows you to bring genuine innovation in. But I think the innovative partnership procedure, which I mentioned earlier, and you know what was really interesting with that one is when you first asked the question at the beginning, the startup didn't have to fill out a 50-page document. It was a few pages. And in fact, one of it was a paragraph of what your innovative solution is and how you can add value to this objective, which I think is fair. And what we asked them is, do you have runway for 6 months? Which again, I think is fair if it's a big scalable product. So, and the other example we've used is we've just launched e-scooter trials in London and we've used the R&D exemption. So my point is that there are multiple routes to market. Procurement colleagues are incredibly helpful to navigate through some of that legislation because it's law. And I think it's my job from an innovation point of view to be absolutely clear on what's the outcome that we want, what's the problem that we want to solve, and work with the innovation and procurement team to say, how do we work together? And let's be realistic with the timelines early on, rather than me always knocking on your door to say, can you do it another week faster? Because that creates tension.
No, that's a very good point. I think this perceived tension between procurement and innovation. Actually, just to giving you some proxy, how these two words are in a certain way getting closer. I've been invited in the past 12 months probably to keynote 3-4 conference focused on procurement, so for the procurement units. And since I'm talking about open innovation, that clearly means that these people are definitely looking at what this open innovation is. And so I think there is a sort of convergence. And I agreed, the ability to sit and work together is front essential. But again, I try most of the time to explain what's the difference between procurement and open innovation, if there is any. But the procurement typically is they identify the solution that they want to procure, and then they're looking for vendors. While open innovation, by definition, is a process that you start scouting, meaning sometimes you don't really have a clear idea what is the solution that you're looking for. And then while you are scouting, you fine tune, and at the end you find the solution. So it's an iterative process by definition, by design, while the traditional procurement process is prescriptive. And that is probably still the step to be taken in order to have these two words merging into, because they're working for the same goal, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and one point to add on that, Alberto, and it's a really, really good one, is when people approach my innovation hub, what we say is, if you already want to buy a pen, and you know what color the pen is, and you know what type it is, then I think you need to talk to the procurement team. If how you're saying to me, you've got this problem, and this pen isn't the answer, let's work through your problem, and let's bring it down the open innovation route to see what's out in the market, and as you say, see what innovative solutions are there, iterate them, and see how they could work for my organization. So quite often, and we're as one with the procurement team here, that we're not creating a backdoor procurement channel. Because they're getting not the right answer from the procurement team, they come to my team. So we're absolutely clear and aligned on that.
That's a very, very great point. But you mentioned this innovative public procedure that, again, is a European Union tool that is around since a while, but in reality, very, very few organizations are using it. What are the main barriers to adopt it? Since you are one of the few that really are using it, what are the main barriers?
I think one is, I think it's a lack of awareness amongst the procurement team.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to, and then I think linked to that, it's linked to culture, trying something new that they don't know about. I think the other third area was we struggled to find use cases and documentation. So as a result, we had to create our own, which again makes it hard, because if you're an early adopter, it's sort of, there's a risk of getting things wrong. I think the other thing is, I don't think people have used it correctly. So this process that you just really described very well, that open innovation is about, you don't know what the solution is. So you haven't got anything in mind, but you know what outcome you want and you know what problem you want to solve. I think some people that have used it, they've bought something that's not innovative. So they could have used another procurement procedure, but as a result, they go through this one and then get stuck, because the R&D stage is there for a very good reason. The R&D stage is there to provide some seed funding, to test some ideas and create some evidence. And then at the end of the evidence stage, you create a business case, which allows you to scale or not scale. But if it's not innovative idea, if it's not innovative enough, then maybe people already know what they want and they've used the wrong route. And I think the other point is, it's really hard sometimes to compare very different solutions. So procurement people are generally very used to buying the same things, but from different vendors, and then they compare it. But in my case, the SAM solution is completely different to the Roadworks modeling solution. And then we had other solutions like barriers that don't fall over. So how do you compare all of them when it comes to value? And you do that openly and fairly. So that could be seen as a hindrance by some.
Yeah, this is another great point, because again, you need to be as much as possible transparent, as much as possible objective. But again, if you are trying to innovate, at the end, you are comparing no longer apple with apple. We compare apple with oranges most of the time.
Yeah.
And you need to make a call. You believe that that's a situation, the orange is better than the apple, or the other way around. And that's in a certain way is perceived as a risky behavior from someone that technically should not take side. And that is easier, again, if I need to give an assessment of this pen, it's pretty easy to decide which is the best pen. Or again, the pen are all the same and just pick up the cheaper one. But again, if you're looking for different approaches to a specific problem statement, as mentioned, that's become hard. Let's take people are making call, and in public organization is culturally complicated. And honestly, I understand the difficulty of people for taking sides or making call in a public organization when they have nothing to gain, and they are exposed to the risk to be judged and potentially to be also sued if they have done something that is not correct. So how do you go around of this situation?
Yeah, and the lessons learned for this particular Open Innovation Program was we spent a lot of time on two things. One is, once we got past the R&D stage, one was to win hearts and minds over internally to make sure now we're moving to scaling. We now need to change the way we operate. This isn't just R&D, this is rollout. So that's point one. We'll come back to that. But answering your question around making sure if we're comparing apples with pears and other things that we've got a consistent way of doing this, we spent a lot of time on the business case. And on that business case, we started to look for metrics around safety, around congestion, around equality. And as a result, we focused on the outcomes and how well, based on the research that was done for 9 weeks, was it getting close to the outcomes that we're after. So we had a quantifiable model that gave us that, and we asked the people that were bidding to fill out that paperwork. So based on the R&D they've done, can you now tell us at scale how this could work? So they told us how it would work. We then assessed whether it was validated or not, and provided some feedback.
And that's interesting. So again, they're working on your side to helping you to take the best possible decision. That is interesting. And then you were mentioning the step from R&D to scale, again, from pilot project to scaling up a project. That probably require different approaches, different methodologies. How's that?
Yeah, so I think organizationally, when you have a proof of concept and an R&D, people are pretty relaxed. You know, it's interesting. I didn't know this was possible, and it's on the sidelines. It's not affecting my day-to-day business, so it's fine. But as soon as you say, right, now you need to start thinking about your technical integration, You need to think about your business processes. You need to start thinking about the right resources and other things. People then naturally say, that's a change. So from now, a nice proof of concept, you're asking me to do business change. And that's a big, big, big shift. So as a result, we spent quite a lot of time after the R&D and during the R&D to start thinking about what's the level of change that's required within our organization to embed these solutions. And my advice to anyone would be, whoever your sponsor is and whoever the relevant business areas are, bring them involved right from the beginning and make sure they realize that during the R&D stage, start asking questions about business change and technical requirements and other things. And then at the end of it, start using that to make a decision on, is your organization ready for this product?
Yes, that's an interesting point, yes. And again, how much is important that top level buy-in an organization like yours? Again, the ability that you know that there are strong sponsors inside the business lines. Again, the people that are supposed to develop the solution, and also on the top of the organization, because at the end, that's most of the time was on the most powerful engine that open innovation relies on.
Yeah, so, and I think, Alberto, everything in our case starts with the customer or the citizen. And we asked Londoners and our users, not just Londoners, but from anywhere in the world who use the Transport Network, what do you want from TfL? How do we build trust with you? And they say three things. They say, every journey matters. I want to get there reliably, safely, securely. I want value for money. And thirdly, I want progress and I want innovation. So our customers are saying, that's what I want if you want me to build trust with you. So that's really important that we've got the customer mandate. Secondly, then it's around, if you want to do things better, cheaper, and quicker, you have to think about innovation. You have to think about emerging technologies and what's next. Otherwise, you'll be irrelevant to the customer. And also it will cost you more money in the long run. So we have these conversations at a really senior level. So my bosses and the commissioner who we just spoke to about internal innovation last week, they really care about how do we bring innovation and innovation culture within the organization. So you have that buy-in at a senior level, but then it's and at customer level, but it's also really important at an operational level you have the buy-in. So it's around who are the right advocates and champions that are really open to innovation. And I think because we're a large organization, we're inundated with problem statements in my team. So we work with people, we learn with them, we scale with them. But part of my job is not just the innovation team doing this, but how do you start providing the capability and skills to local business areas? And how do they turn this into a business as usual process? So this methodology that you mentioned around open innovation, how can they apply it? Because the more people that are doing it, that will help drive the culture change that we want and create that value for our organization and the city that we're after.
Really, yes. And question about the impact of COVID and the pandemic. Again, all transport organizations will be badly impacted. How that impacted TfL, and specifically how in a certain way does the pandemic stopped, froze your innovation effort, or at the end you continue to the journey that you started?
Yeah, so I think COVID has had a drastic impact on Transport for London, but it's had an impact, as you say, on cost transit agencies and cities, and just to anyone across the world. It's had a drastic impact, and it's had an impact on us in lots of ways. Clearly, with ridership reducing, it's had a massive impact on our fares revenue, which is significant from a operational budget perspective. It's obviously had an impact on us. Before last March, my job was to encourage more people to use public transport, and suddenly, towards the end of March, it was, please don't use public transport. It's only for key workers, and so that was a big cultural shift. And of course, safety was at the heart of everything that we did. Keeping our customers safe, keeping our staff safe, and so it's had a significant impact. And ridership is still nowhere near the levels that they were pre-pandemic. So that's something we're working through now, not just as a transit agency, but as a city. But encouragingly, more people are using public transport and moving around. But the other question is, from an innovation point of view, what impact did it have? And I think initially we did pause quite a lot of the activity. But what we found, Alberto, during it is when there's a crisis like this, you actually remove some of the process and you become more agile as an organization. So a couple of examples I'll give you is in London, they introduced a new hospital called Nightingale and they put that up. But part of that was to provide a transport service for key workers, the doctors and nurses. But what we wanted to make sure is if they're getting onto the bus, they know where the bus is and they know when the bus will arrive to their location. Because otherwise you've got lots of people congregating in the same area. So to avoid that, we've created a system where we put sensors on buses and we provided real-time information into the hospital. Now, normally a project like that would take 3, 6, 9 months. We did this in 2 weeks. We brought a startup in. They put some, and you know what? They used sensors. They used iPhone. They used phones. They put the phone in on the bus. They used the GPS signal, and that tracked where the bus was. And in turn, they provided real-time information to the doctors and nurses. So that's one example, and there was a series of other examples that helped us during the pandemic. So it does help the culture, and we're trying to bottle some of that culture and think about how do we apply that going forward.
Perfect. And I think they are a great example of how things can really move forward, also in complicated times. Because at the end, you cannot stop the innovation pace despite all the circumstances. Obviously, the situation is more complicated, but still, innovation is future, and then you typically try to move forward, not backwards. So to close our conversation, Rakesh, you already mentioned what are the top 3 tips that you would like to share with your peers working in public organization across the globe and facing with similar issues, or probably just about to start, or just about to try to remove the internal barriers to enable open innovation?
Yeah, so I think the first one is, and I think is a question you asked, leadership. I think you have to have that leadership and that buy-in, and that narrative and that story that you're telling to your peers needs to be clear, and it needs to be simple. Innovation cannot come across as scary. It's got to be grounded, and relevant to the business. So that's number one. I think number 2, create this matrix way of working. Everyone take your badges off and focus on the common problem statement. So bring HR, technical, legal, procurement, innovation, all around the same to solve this issue. And how do we bring the market in? I think thirdly, create a clear narrative for the innovators and be clear on what you want from them, but also be clear on what ideas do they have and how does that support your horizon scanning work? Because you will always have new problems. So you need to be at the front of the organization in terms of thought leadership around new technologies. And one more, I know you said 3, but the 4th one would be, build your advocates, build your friends. Don't be worried to try things. Put some safety blankets in place, security net, safety nets in place. And I think try it, do it in a controlled manner, and I guarantee you will see some value. But you've got to do it the right way.
Perfect. I think we have also an extra tip, and I think your peers will definitely appreciate and share. So I think that's all by now, Rakesh. I think very valuable experience. I think valuable to be shared, and let's keep the communication channel open, because I think it's important to monitor the next progress that you guys are up to, and I think that there probably will be some additional learning and some additional best practice to be shared. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you.